Greetings, friends. Wanting here. This is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Update for week of February 2nd through February 8th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day, because we are going to now start in the Zaporizhzhia / Dnipropetrovsk direction. And this week, very interesting things started to happen. And we actually don't have a lot of details, but because it's very shrouded in the fog of war. And what I'm talking about is that apparently in the Zaporizhzhia direction, specifically in this area of the northern part and then up to around the Ternivata area, there has been a big Ukrainian counteroffensive to try to break the Russian position here, or in the Zaporizhzhia, as they try to move towards Zaporizhzhia, I should say. And now the thing is that we have some... Now, Russians are talking about this. Ukrainians, the General Syrskyi, the commander, talked about that they're doing something here. Now, the thing is, also what happened this week was that the Starlink died throughout the entire front. And because there's no Starlink, it's very hard for people on the ground to report what's happening, because it now takes a lot longer to get things on the internet than it was before. And so now we're confused on what exactly is happening. And so we only have hearsay. So we don't know exactly things that are happening, but we have some ideas based on the information that's crumbling towards us. Now, obviously we don't know what's happening yet. That's why a lot of mappers have not changed it yet. But according to people who have changed, or at least have updates on the ground, is that so one of the biggest news is that the Ukrainians did some sort of big counterattack here. And we actually had geolocations of this, of the Ukrainians re-entering Ternivata, and they were getting bombed here, but they did dismounted and sent troops here. So it looks like they, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, that they pushed the Russians out of Ternivata, and also along with this pushed all the way to Zaporizhzhia, this area right here, and kind of basically pushed all the way to the river here. So we shall see. Maybe do they disembark and kick out all the Russians here? Is Ternivata now gray zone? We don't know. The thing is that like this war, like anything in this war, a lot of it is very much fluid in the gray zone. So but at least for one of the biggest geolocations we got is that the Ukrainians re-enter Ternivata. So yeah, I mean, I expected this even if there wasn't some big counterattack, because the Ukrainians really need to stop the Russians from taking Ternivata, because taking Ternivata would have been a very big blow and would have allowed the Russians to accumulate a huge force on the other side of the Gancha River here. So the Ukrainians trying to prevent the Russians from consolidating here. A very good tactical sense, but we shall see how that develops. Maybe are they able to expel the Russians fully from the other side of the Gancha River? We shall see. And then also we've had two... this is where we don't have geolocations, but this is where also the Ukrainians and Russians are saying this is where the Ukrainians are attacking. They said there's an attack coming from kind of like Pokrovsky towards the village of Guy, and then also trying to reach toward the town of Vyshinya here, which is one of the major logistics nodes here. And then another one coming from Velika Mikhailivka, where they took back the town of Aristopol, and then are trying to go, are moving from Sonsivka towards Beresova. This is another big town here. And as you can see, it looks like the main thing is to destroy because if they could take Visona and Beresova, which is kind of looks like what the main goal for the Ukrainians are, this would cut off the main logistics, kind of supplying the Russians in this northern and Dnipropetrovsk direction, Zaporizhzhia direction here. And, yeah, but right now we don't have any idea of what's happening here. A lot of sources are saying that they have not reached them yet, that they've reached Guy, they've reached, like, Sonsivka, but right now they haven't actually reached their main objectives yet. So it's still, a lot of it is still in a not a gray zone, but just fog of war. It's not even like, oh, we don't know. It's not even like a gray zone. It's like we still don't have information what's coming. So it's a very big question mark on what exactly the Ukrainians have achieved so far, and especially because the counteroffensive allegedly started yesterday, maybe a little over a day ago. So it's still new. It's still fresh. We still don't know what exactly is happening, but that is the information at least we've gotten from various hearsay sources, and probably next week we'll have a clearer idea of what they've accomplished, if the Russians are able to push back this counterattack. So we shall see. Now, in the southern part, kind of near Dobropillya itself, is where the Russians are making some progress, and there's been no real mention of any Ukrainian counterattack here. The biggest thing is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Starlink here. We had the Russians raising their flags here, just after they took Zaporizhzhia last last week, and then also we had geolocation of the Russians being in Tessanivka here, and so it looks like the Russians have pushed all the way to this rail line here to the south of Zalizhzhia, and are right now trying to consolidate in this area right here. So, and then also along with this, we had one geolocation in the northern part of Zalizhzhia of the Russians being here. Now that could be DRG activity. We don't know if that's just or if that we don't know if that's a determined Russian assault or just reconnaissance and force. We shall see. But with the Russians moving and clearing out these fields in the south of Dnipropetrovsk up to the rail line here, which is also something they've been doing. They've been clearing a bunch of these fields in the up against this rail line in the past week or so. So just slowly but surely moving towards the southern part of Zporizhzhia, with also the push in Ukrainka and Tesovkoko. If they're able to hold here, they'll be able to then attack Zporizhzhia from the north, which is what they're already doing. And so if the Russians can take Zporizhzhia, this would allow them to create another a stronger buffer zone in the southern part. And then the main goal will be moving towards Vrska Tersi, and then probably up along all the trenches here towards Amulet, and they're able to do this because they're able to outflank the trenches from the east. So that's probably the Rush. So the Russians are making have made some small, also made progress in the south, and it doesn't look like the Ukrainians are attacking here. But I'm pretty certain that they're going to try to do that soon. Probably the main goal here is that if they could disrupt the defenses in the north here, this would stop the Russian push in the south, because they really need this northern flank to hold their flank here. So I do think maybe they might take Zporizhzhia, but then they might stop it if the Ukrainian counteroffensive here gets too successful. But we shall see. Again, a lot of unknowns, a lot of big question marks. But yeah, that's that direction. And there's not really been any other changes in kind of like this area right here. There's still battles going on for this area near Rishny. There's still battles going on for these villages in the hillside, like who are on the upper high ground. So, but we haven't had any changes, like any updates showing like, oh, we had another geolocation or another map change or something that shows maybe the Russians have taken Malodelinovka, or the Ukrainians are actually still in Novokilinovka. We don't know the exact, it's still a very gray zone, but we do know, as we talked about last week, the Russians are in Pavlovka, Leukemia. They were in Novokilinova. So it was, it seems like the Russians were here, but we haven't had any updates to see if there's been any like, to clarify things here. So, but battles are still going on despite what's happening, but nothing has changed in terms of what we could update, because we haven't had any info coming from this direction here. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction. This is also where some small changes have happened here. The biggest thing, one of the biggest news that happened this week, we had confirmation of this, is that the Russians have basically cleared everything. So behind this rail line, there used to be this giant, like, kind of incursion the Ukrainians had, which they were able to operate in. And it looks like this week the Ukrainians retreated from here. And I think the reason they've been doing this is because a lot of their assault units that they're actually using the Zaporizhzhia direction, at least who they're naming, like the 420th Assault Brigade and so forth, were actually in the Dobropillya Pokrovsk area, and they've withdrawn. So it looks like the Ukrainians don't have the troops to like continue doing assaults and making like kind of these gray zones here. So it looks like they've kind of stopped trying to keep doing attacks towards Pokrovsk and Middleground and redeployed them towards in the Zaporizhzhia direction. But so because I think the Russians were able to take advantage of that and took back, this kind of gray zone that occurred behind those, in Sukishka near Zatashuk, and it seems like they were able to clear this kind of little gray zone here, and because they had geolocation of the Russians being here. Along with this, we had more and more geolocation of the Russians operating in these kind of like fields around in the north of Radinsky here. We also talked about, while we don't have geolocation of this, pro-Russian sources saying they also took the small mine near Radinsky here, and because they claim they kicked the Ukrainians out of Radinsky, but it's still the Ukrainians and some neutral mappers saying Radinsky could still be infiltrated. So, but in any case, it looks like now the Russians are kind of breaking this like Radinsky nut that that was kind of in their way, and it seems like now they're also sending troops up to Belitsky here, and it seems like they're gonna, one of the main goals for the Russians is to take the town of Belitsky and Grishny, because these two big villages will, and this is actually more like a town, will allow them to have a forward operating base to start moving towards these line of villages to the south of Dobropillya, which will allow them to get closer and closer towards their main objective, which is Dobropillya. So yeah, lots of progress on this area, taking more of these tree lines here. So we shall see how that develops. In the north here, we've we talked about how the Russians took Turetsky last week. This week, sources are saying the Russians are now trying to improve their gains around it. They say they took the stronghold that's right here, and I think there's like another stronghold that's like around here that they have not announced they've taken yet. But it seems like right now the Russians are trying to hold their position around Turetsky and hold their position here. But besides that, there's not been that much huge changes. Just trying to consolidate in Turetsky a little bit. The Russians are still. We don't know if they've consolidated Novodebaz or Vilna yet, but it's definitely something the Russians are in. But no changes as of yet in terms of consolidation. A bit more to the kind of southern, like kind of the western part of this area. We had even pro-Ukrainian sources like Deep State announcing that the Russians are turning like the central part of Grishny into a gray zone, because now they've consolidated in the southern part. They're now fighting for the central part of Grishny. So right now it's kind of like the northern part is under full Ukrainian control. The southern part is under Russian control, and the central part is kind of mostly still under Ukrainian control, but it has Russian troops operating there and trying to push Ukraine out. So the Russians are definitely picking up the pace in the battle for Grishny. And then lastly, in Novopavlovka, the Russians are still trying to secure this kind of southern part of Novopavlovka. Most mappers are now trying to say they're trying to clear everything behind this highway here, and that only this like kind of northern part of southern Novopavlovka is still supported. So just slowly but surely, the Russians are holding on to Novopavlovka. Again, as I mentioned last week, it's very hard to secure Novopavlovka because to send more troops here, you have to go through a bunch of open fields and you'll be attacked by drones. So it's hard to support, but the Russians are step by step trying to take Novopavlovka. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction, and there's been the Russians are also stepping up their offensive activity in Kostyantynivka. This is where one of the main offensive actions the Russians have been focusing on since this year began. The main thing kind of is more in this kind of western part of Kostyantynivka. This week, the Russian Ministry of Defense and pro-Russian sources said they have completely captured the town of Stepanovka. We had geolocation of the Russians operating in this kind of like southern part of Stepanovka, not in the northern part. But I'm pretty certain that if the Russians are operating in the southern part, they've taken the northern part as well. And and so I do think that the town of Stepanovka has fallen, as pro-Russian sources are saying. We just need another geolocation of the Russians being in the north to kind of fully confirm it. We also talked about how the Russians took Berezovsk last week. This week, even pro-neutral mappers are saying, well, it hasn't fallen yet, that the Russians are in Berezovsk fighting for it, just not. It's hard to consolidate here. That being said, Berezovsk and Stepanovka has been captured according to pro-Russian sources, and now also the Russians are in Ilyinovka, and that this entire area is kind of like one giant gray zone. And but they actually say if they had to choose, according to a lot of sources, that this is actually mostly under Russian control. It's just very hard to secure because the Ukrainians are still in this like high-rise building area of Kostyantynivka, and they're able to continue doing counterattacks to disrupt Russian consolidations of Ilyinovka. So that is something that the Russians have not claimed they've captured, which makes sense, because I do think holding onto Ilyinovka, especially when the flanks of it are still unsecure, is going to be very hard for the Russians. But I do think Berezovsk and Stepanovka have been taken. They just need to consolidate here a little bit more. But yeah, lots of very good progress happening here. There's been a lot of bombings happening in Kostyantynivka. Like any Ukrainians trying to enter Kostyantynivka keep getting blown up, especially with vehicles. So it's a very tough nut. And I do think Kostyantynivka will be one of the biggest gains for the Russians in the first half of 2026. But along with this, in terms of Kostyantynivka itself, instead of its suburb outskirts, a lot of pro-Russian sources, we actually had geolocation of the Russians operating in this kind of what they call the garden community, this area right here. And that they've claimed that the Russians have captured this, which makes sense. We've had multiple updates of the Russians, saying there's DRG activity towards Dnipropetrovsk, and in this kind of residential area here as well. So the fact that the Russians we had another geolocation and some claims saying that this garden community has been taken, which I think backs it up. So I do think the main thing for the Russians right now is if they could consolidate here and break into kind of this part of Kostyantynivka, they can continue pushing deeper and deeper into it. The main problem, though, is that as they continue pushing towards the central part of Kostyantynivka, is that the Ukrainians that are still in this area are able to still do counterattacks, and this is why it's kind of like been a pain in the ass for the Russians to advance here, because they've not kind of cleared this area of Ukrainians near Chasiv Yar, at least in front of Chasiv Yar. So it's definitely a bit of a hassle, and hopefully we shall see how the Russians are able to counter that. Alrighty, so that's the Kostyantynivka direction, just some more progress around the flanks mostly. And then now in the Slavyansk direction, this is also where the Russians are making a lot of interesting progress. This is, it used to be this area, the Seversk area, was like the slowest part of the front for almost the entire since I've been recording. But now that, since, they took Seversk, this is actually where one of the most active places where the Russians are making progress. The biggest thing, in terms of the battle for these line of villages here, this kind of in the southern part here, the Manivka, Glubovka, Prolivia. We had geolocation of the Russians being in Pervilia. We had another geolocation of the Russians being in Makivka. So, now the only question is about this town of Glubovka, which is like this, I think, one-way street village that connects Pervilia with Makivka. It should probably all be just like one. I think they all kind of interconnect with each other. I don't think they're very separated per se. But with that being said, it is definitely the Russians are breaking. We had the Russians, breaking. We had the Russians in Pervilia. We have the Russians in Makivka, and so now it's just a matter of time before Glubovka probably also falls. And the main thing will be the Russians trying to enter, just kind of hold their positions along the canal here. And I'm expecting by the end of February that they will clear out these villages here. This has been the frontline villages for like the last 2-3 years, like 3 years or so. So it's definitely been built up by the Ukrainians. There's a lot of defenses here, but the Russians breaking through here and actually being in these villages are very bad news for the Ukrainians. So I do think these villages are gonna finally fully fall probably within a week, and then or two, and then they're gonna consolidate here. But yeah, the Russians being in Makivka, Pervilia, very bad news. Also, more even neutral mappers are saying that the entire town of Dnipropetrovsk has been captured, or at least almost like about 85% of it, and that the only thing that's left is like kind of some of these buildings that are to the north here. But the central part of Dnipropetrovsk has been taken by the Russians, so that's very bad news. This is a very decent-sized village that the Russians can use to consolidate, and from here, they're going to move towards Fedorovka and Lipivka, and this will probably go in tandem with the Russian push here, so that the main thing for the Russians will then be something like this, and then this will flat out the front in the southern part as they try to move towards the main goal, which is Alexandrivka. But as they move towards that, the Russians are going to be pushing to the north, and this is exactly what they're doing here, because one of the biggest changes happening here is the Russians are continuously clearing these hills that are to the south of Sakitna and to the east of Kuriluka. They've captured more and more of these tree lines here. They captured some of these hills that are here. There's still some hills left around Kuriluka, but the Russians are slowly but surely pushing here. And again, the main goal for the Russians here is to take the town of Kuriluka and Kalinovka here, because then if they could do that, and have something like this, along with the push here, then the Russians will be able to attack Alexandrivka from the north and from the south, and then do some sort of counter, like kind of pincer attack, and then take it. Because then once Alexandrivka is taken, the Russians will keep moving along the Seversky Donetsk river, and then up along the Seversky Donetsk canal, and then one of the last main goals for the Russians will be the town of Mykolaievka here, which holds the Slavyansk power plant here. And then once they take that, then I think that'll be that's right now the goal for the Russians. I don't think they're going to continue pushing towards like Kramatorsk or Slavyansk, because there's a ton of like defenses, but I don't rule that out. I think maybe they're going to try to maybe encircle it a bit more, but maybe they will do a direct attack eventually. We shall see. Anyway, that's a lot of progress happening. Right now Dnipropetrovsk is about to be taken. These line of villages are about to be taken. The Russians are pushing towards Kuriluka. So lots and lots of things are happening in this direction, and I expect a lot of good things. I do think that maybe by the end of February or so, it might be very possible that the Russians have something like this going on. They're putting their claws around Alexandrivka. So we shall see how that develops. In the Lyman direction, there's not been that much changes. We just had some clarifications. The biggest clarification is that the Russians are indeed in control of Stavky. This was a very important village on the way to Lyman, and in like December or so, the Ukrainians did a counterattack to try to re-enter Stavky, and then we never heard of the Stavky was basically in a gray zone for such a long time that we didn't know what was happening there. But then we had another geolocation come out this week of the Russians getting bombed in Stavky, so it does show the Russians retook it. We also had some more changes happening in these fields here. The Russians taking more and more of these fields that are to the around in the front of Lyman. So the Russians are just slowly but surely putting this pressure on Lyman. We have the Russians in the most southern part of Lyman, and then some sources are saying the Russians are also in this kind of northern part of Lyman here, in this residential area. So it does seem like the Russians have some small positions here, but they're not advancing in it. Maybe they're trying to finish up the battle for Dobropillya. Who knows? But besides, we haven't actually had any progress around on the flanks of Lyman this week. So, but we shall see how that develops for them. And then now we're going to go to the Kupyansk and Kharkov directions. This is also where there's been a lot of interesting, well, actually, yeah, just some interesting things. We talked about how last week the Russians, there's been a lot of progress in the eastern bank for the Russians in the Kupyansk area. So this week we haven't really had more changes. The main thing about information coming from this area is that it seems like the main area where the Russians are trying to consolidate around Kuchuria and Petropavlovka, and then the Russians are also entering where they've not captured, but they're infiltrating and having battles is for Polonia and Kurilyivka, and then the main Ukrainian position where they're still in full control is Kupyansk Vilsanoye here. So it seems like the Russians are. This is kind of the idea. So, like, in Petropavlovsk and Kurilyivka is where the Russians are mostly in control. Kupyansk Vilsanoye is where the Ukrainians are mostly in control, and then there's like a big kind of fluid gray zone between Kurilyivka and Polonia, where the Russians are trying to take it and push the Ukrainians out. But besides that, there's not been really. That's kind of the idea of where the Russians are. But again, Kupyansk is one of those areas where there's a giant fluid gray zone, and we don't know what the hell's happening here. We had a geolocation happening in Kupyansk itself in the western bank about the Russians were being bombed somewhere in the center here. So it does show the Russians are still in the center part of Kupyansk, but besides that, there's not been that much. How do you say it? So it does show like the Russians are still holding on here, but again, we don't know for how long. But I do think that the Russians clearing out this eastern bank of Kupyansk will make their lives in the western part of Kupyansk more better. But besides that, there's not been that much changes. In the south here, we had a geolocation of the Russians being in Bukoslavka, but it's a big gray zone. There's been actually a lot of battles happening here, so we don't know exactly are the Russian so around the battles for Bukoslavka, Novopolanovka, Novokurilyivka. The Ukrainians are trying to do counterattacks into Zaporizhzhia and such. So it's just a very big fluid gray zone here. So we still need more clarification on what the hell is happening in this area as well. So we shall see. And then in the kind of more of the Kharkov direction, there's not actually been that much changes. The biggest change is that the Russians have captured this border town of Chunanivka here. I always thought it was interesting why they never took it. It connects literally with the Russian position, with a road here, so the Russians could cross and take Chunanivka, but they never did that until this week. So it looks like they finally captured Chunanivka here. Very good news for the Russians. But I do think the main Ukrainian defenses is around the town of Vilka Nunovka here and around these villages here. That's probably why they didn't put up much of a fight for Chunanivka. Just as, for example, the Russians, after they broke through the border defenses, the Ukrainians retreated back to kind of this line of defense along the river here with these around this row of villages here. And so we shall see how that exactly so right now the main we shall see if the Russians push any more here, or they're just taking a bunch of border towns just to stretch Ukrainian resources here. But besides that, that's the only thing that really changed here. And there's not really been any changes in this kind of Volchansk region as well, so we shall see how that develops. And then in the Sumy direction, there's been actually some interesting changes in the Sumy direction. The main big change is that the Russians have entered another part of the Sumy Oblast and have taken the town of Pokrovka. This village right here, again, another border town. Again, a lot of these border incursions, seems like the Russians are trying to do some sort of thing where they're trying to stretch Ukrainian forces without having to divert any sort of big counteroffensive. They could accumulate a couple, maybe 1 or 2 dozen troops in this village, cross the border town, after a few bombardments, and then take a border town, and then the Ukrainians don't have enough troops here to assemble a counterattack here. And so there's like, well, it's a border town village. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have any strategic implications. And so I do think after taking once they take Pokrovka, I don't think there's going to be any more advancements here. Again, they take Grabovsky last month, but then there's been no really any changes since that point. I thought they'd continue pushing towards Razny or try to take Krasnopilya. So I said that if the Russians are actually serious about this area, the main goal would be Krasnopilya. But it seems like they took one border town village and stopped, or two technically, and then took another border town village now this month. But it's maybe it'll stop here. We don't know. Maybe they continue pushing their luck here, but we haven't seen. Maybe I think that this is just more of a pinning down operations to bring Ukrainian forces here. Most mappers are saying that this kind of I call this the Dnipropetrovsk pimple, has been kind of popped by the Russians, which makes sense. I always thought, this kind of pimple area was going to be extremely hard for the Ukrainians to hold because it's surrounded by Russian territory. So it seems like the Russians are just making this more flatter, and the Ukrainians are retreating towards Dnipropetrovsk, which is what they actually wanted to defend. So this pimple's kind of been popped, which I always expected was going to happen. And then speaking of kind of pinning down troops. The main thing for the Russians here is they've, we talked about this last month. The Russians have, entered this part of Sumy Oblast and, took this, the Dobropillya forest here and then the small village of Kostyantynivka. But again, it's like, I think this is just a way to try to slow down the Ukrainian attacks here, or to pin down the Ukrainians here, because I don't think they're just trying to attack all over the Sumy Oblast to draw Ukrainian reinforcements here, but I don't think they're doing anything serious in Sumy. But besides that, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Lots of interesting things are happening. Lots of, Ukrainian attacks, Russian attacks, lots of things. We shall see how they continue to develop into mid-February. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates. Comment your thoughts, share this video around, like this video. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.